Day Trading Visual Basics is a price reversal recognition system. It has components within it. For example, there are three powers within the system: indicator power, formula power, and procedures power. The indicator power, of course, is the 22 market force recognition indicators. The formula power is when we take the patterns and the conditions and the signals and use them to find high probability trades. And the procedures power is when we analyze and examine and verify and test each potential trade that we look at to either buy, sell short, or pass on that trade because the conditions weren't good enough. When you think of those patterns, we find a pattern, we verify the conditions, and we use a signal, or we wait for a signal to enter the trade. That idea, that formula, is carried through into gap analysis when we search the three gap patterns to find gaps. Supporting evidence then is the conditions, or I'll refer to them as extra conditions, that would not necessarily appear or qualify as in the other types of conditions that we have. There are basically three types of conditions. You have the requirement conditions. That would be like if you had a red spike. You've got a zip red down under 50 and a zip yellow down above 50. And it's the condition of the zip and yellow lines are basically that they're going down. Now that's a required condition. That's a required direction, indicator direction line that we refer to as a condition. Because if you have a red peak, then the lines are going up. Red's above 50, yellow's under 50. You get the idea. So you have required conditions. You also have good conditions. Like, for example, when you have a red spike, the 23 pattern types up and the 23 pattern types down are patterns that we identify that have high probability potential. Generically, when you find them in a scan, if you just scan for the basics, you might find 2 out of 10 that would have a nice green candle the next day. And so we use those conditions that generated the nice green candles in those 2 out of 10 indicators, or 2 out of 10 patterns, and then we basically try to copy those conditions or find other indicators with those conditions, thereby giving us a real high probability ratio. I mean, above 90%, and oftentimes above 95%. And so now you've got the required conditions, you've got good conditions. Also, one other thing. One of the first things that we look at when we're looking for good conditions is we look for the 7 short-term trend line directions. You've got 3 groups there. You've got the trend trio, yellow, pink, blue lines. You've got the power, orange and green, and you've got the swing, red and green. Those 3 groups form 7 lines. The trend trio moves faster than the other 2 groups, or it changes directions more quickly, and as a result identifies turnarounds more quickly. Cycle turnarounds, like cycle highs or cycle lows. Now, those conditions, I mean, there's more. That's the very first thing, or probably the very first thing that we look at, is to identify which way the short-term trend lines are going. And then, of course, there's other types of good conditions that we relate to, like the location of where zip yellow is. If it's low and under 10, things are going down. If it's high and above 70, things are going up. And of course, there's many others. When you have now that idea of patterns, conditions, and signals is carried through into gap analysis. And you might have, like, for example, the three gap analysis patterns are identical indicators, down touches in the trend chart, and proximity group patterns, both location patterns and shape patterns. So in other words, the power 4 line, which is pink, blue, white, and yellow, the power 4 group is maybe above the power orange or under the power orange. And then the fifth line, power Zion, which we then call with the power 4, we then call it power 5. If it has no yellow line, we're talking about the power 3. The power Zion can be divergent to the power 3 or the power 4 based on the dividing line is the power orange line. So Zion might be under power orange and the power 3 might be above power orange. Those are locations. They're typical locations where patterns often appear when we have a gap up. When you have a gap down, you have identical indicators, but you have up touches instead of down touches. And there are 6 down touches that qualify and 6 up touches that qualify in the trend chart. And then you have to have one of those down touches or up touches that qualify within the trend chart in order to get a gap. Now, the supporting evidence is, or let me comment on one other thing. In your identical indicators, they're basically shape patterns like BOC patterns, right leg W pattern, a high M pattern, a TOC, top of cycle pattern. They're basically patterns, and you can have, out of the 22 market force recognition indicators, you can have a group of them with the same indicator. So it's referred to as identical indicators. To get gaps, we like to see a majority, or in other words, at least 12 out of the 22 are in a one pattern identical indicator setup. Like you have 20, or like you have 12 BOC patterns. You might have 12 BOC patterns and then 4 right leg W higher patterns. And then you have 16 total patterns in a 2 pattern group. So you can basically have a 1 pattern or a 2 pattern group, but you need to have 12 indicators in however it is arranged. Now, supporting evidence would be another pattern, not like the 2 that created the setup. Not like the BOC or the right leg W higher pattern. It could be a red spike. It could be zip Zion lowest or zip Zion highest. It could be zip green at 100 or zip green at 0. And there's a few other patterns that we identify with that are what we refer to as extra patterns or supporting evidence. You can have just leading indicator lines, like the swing pink going up. Because it's a leading indicator, it's directing us toward the price movement. So in any case, what you've got is a variety of conditions that are extra beyond the required conditions, like you find in, you have to have 12 identical indicators, you have to have a down touch, and there's not a required condition for the location patterns and the shape patterns in the proximity group pattern. It's more like it's a case of when you have a particular pattern that appears or that you're analyzing, then the indicators will typically be in 2 or 3 different locations. If you have a different pattern, like say you have a gap down pattern, then the indicators will be typically in 2 or 3 different locations. And oftentimes when patterns are going up, the power lines are above 0 when you get a gap up, and when you get a gap down, oftentimes the power 4 or power 3 are under 0, with power Zion above the power 3 or the power 4. That does not always happen, but there is a general location that typically occurs with those location patterns and the particular shape patterns when we have a gap up. All you need to get a gap up is the basic requirements within those 3 patterns. However, if you have additional supporting evidence or extra, I'll just say extra ammunition, extra lines that are telling you that this movement coming up is going to be stronger, then you have what we refer to as extra evidence or supporting evidence. And sometimes you only need 2 or 3 little things, but patterns are really powerful. If you get a red spike or you get Zip Zion highest or lowest, those are 2 patterns that often appear with the other patterns in gaps. And I think it's basically because, of course, Zip Zion is a 1 pattern condition. Red spike is 2 pattern. The other one also is yellow twins. That would be Zip yellow and power yellow. As you know, when Zip yellow and power yellow are both highest and going down, you're in a downtrend. And when they're both lowest and going up, you're in an uptrend. And so there's lines, leading indicators. There's different named patterns like those that I named. There's also different shape patterns. There's about 7 different patterns that we typically look at in the proximity or the power lines, and that's about the same in all of the 22 market force recognition indicator lines as well. But supporting evidence is the key to achieving, or let me say, recognizing movements that will have big gaps. And it's the supporting evidence, when we find that supporting evidence, that we will oftentimes get those big gaps. Because keep in mind, even every time you've got 22 market force recognition indicator lines, and if you've got 15 or 18, let's say you've got 15 in a 2 pattern group, and then you get a red spike, then you've created, or you've basically taken 2 more of those lines, and now they're pointing, or the pattern is telling you that the price is pointing to go up next day. What's really happening there is, if you divide the 22 as a percentage, each line is worth 4.5%. So when you use 2 of the lines in a red spike, you have now generated an additional 9% increase in the potential availability of recognition. Or in other words, you've used up 2 more of those lines, and now you've got, instead of 15, you now have 17. Well, that fact really changes into a multiplication factor, that because you only need one additional pattern or one additional, I mean, if you get 2 or 3, it's great. If you have multiple divergence, it's great. There's just many different ways to add strength or to see strength. Remember, when we're identifying strength, it's through indicator line length and it's through divergence. Also, one other key thing. One of my favorite divergence is trend red, like trend red in a TOC higher pattern and power red in a TOC lower pattern. That almost invariably causes a gap up. It's one of my favorite divergent pair. They are part of the big three. Swing Zion is the third member of the big three. We don't know why, but those three together create a combined force that reacts pretty strong in the way of a one day, next day up movement, but usually in a multiple day movement, 3 to 5 day pattern or whatever the case may be. And typically if you're going out 4 to 5 days, you're going to get one day in there that'll be a downturn or a pullback before it continues up. But the point I'm trying to make is that supporting evidence to find big gaps is the key. One other thing, you can get like for example, you can get a line, you can get 2 patterns that create divergence. Just the fact that those lines are longer or shorter, it actually affects the power in the gap. So there's a variety of ways to look at line length. I mean, if you compare 2 movements and one of those lines moves 5 and the other one, and in the other example the line has moved 11 or 12, you know, they both move 11 or 12 or they both move 5 or 6, the 11 or 12, because they push down, it's going to create a pushback force that's going to cause, that typically causes larger gaps. So there's just a variety of things to look at, but the information is there. You just need to recognize what how it works and what it's about. So those are the ideas behind supporting evidence, or the concepts behind the 3 gap patterns, which is the method that we use to identify supporting evidence. When we're looking at normal cycle highs and lows, and we see a one day, next day up pattern, just based on maybe a BOC higher pattern or something along those lines, we think of those situations as good conditions rather than as supporting evidence. They're really basically the same thing, because they both contribute to the number of lines directing us in a particular price direction. And so you can look at next day ups, which is a one day movement, or you can look at uptrends, which I think of is as like a 2 to 4 or 3 to 5 day movement, or you can look at gaps. And we obviously need the 3 pattern gap formula to find gaps, and we use the supporting evidence to verify that. What we call supporting evidence in the 3 gap pattern analysis is the same thing that we call good conditions when we're dealing with the other side of the coin, meaning a one day up movement or an uptrend. Because as we search for things, we're not always going to find gaps, but you certainly can find 15 identical indicators but it might not have a down touch, and it will create a nice 2 or 3 day up movement because it had so many indicators that were identical. So it's like a degree of information. The greater the degree of additional information that you get in the form of good conditions or in the form of supporting evidence, the greater the movement typically appears to occur. So the one thing that I want to show you here is within the paperwork. Now this happens to have come out of the 3-gap pattern formula, and I've put this in different places. You can copy it and make it available on your desktop while you're watching things. But basically what we've got here are types of supporting evidence. I've listed 4 types. They're line, that's A, B, C, D. It may be hard to read, but I just wanted to make you aware of this. There's lines like leading indicators. B is indicator lines like highest or lowest. C is patterns up and down. And we obviously exclude the identical patterns in the 1 or 2 pattern groupings. We just look at those other patterns. And then D is divergence. And then I've got, as you can see here, there are 27 items that I've listed, and it's just a partial list. I spent some time, I got a lot of them, I got a significant amount of them, but what I'm trying to say is that it's not complete, but these are the things that will occur that you look for in the form of supporting evidence when you're looking for gaps up. If you go down to the end of the page, you then have 27 items that you would look for gaps down. And so this is a handy reference point or list when you're looking at or searching for gaps. It's there are also 4 supporting documents that I've put together, and those are also listed under the logo as supporting documents, and that information that I just showed you is there as well. It's in several different places on the website, but it will help you in looking in identifying what you're searching for when you're thinking of supporting evidence that will give you added power to gaps, or basically added strength to movements. So it's a powerful system. We're amazed at what it can do. The heart of the system is the sensitive indicators, because without the indicators we wouldn't have the patterns or the conditions. And so we know that we have probably, I mean, you know, we're biased. We think we have the best system on the planet. And but I tell you, we don't know of anybody else. I personally do not know of anybody else that can find strength within a movement. I mean, if you took 10 different stocks on any given day, 1 or 2, maybe 3 of those, so 10 or 20 or 30% of those, we can tell you which direction the price is going to go on those stocks. We cannot tell you on every single one, and part of that is I'm mixing in that is strength, because we are not interested in, I mean, we might know a direction that candle is likely to go, but we also can see that there's no strength with it. And so when there's no strength with it, we're really not interested in trading that particular stock either. So there is a small percentage of stocks. I mean, you know, keep in mind there's probably 20,000 that are being traded every day, so 10% is, you know, 2,000 stocks. But you still need to find them, and you do that through the scanner, and you do that through radar screen. We've got 8 master radar screens, all with probably a dozen columns of different types of divergence. We've got the complete 6 down touches in one master radar screen, the 6 master up touches in radar screen. We've got crossovers and equal indicators. There's 8. We also have the short-term trend, the 7 short-term trend lines, so that you can see which lines are up or down just at a glance. I mean, it's really fast using the radar screen method to identify identical indicators, down touches or up touches, or divergence on a particular symbol or stock. So, I mean, it's great when you're looking at the divergence screen and all of a sudden there's 5 or 6 pairs that are divergent. That's a pretty strong indication of a powerful movement. So it's amazing. We really encourage you to keep looking and identify with what we have here, because I started this. I did my first trade in 2007, and that was more than 10 years ago. And as a result of that, I then put together indicators. It was probably 3 or 4 years before I started putting the right indicators together. I was building indicators, but not realizing that they weren't the right ones. And so today, after many years, it was probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 years before we discovered the patterns and the conditions. And then it's taken us several years to examine them and verify and test and retest and synchronize them into pairs. And so now we've got a system. We've got a formula that we use with the system. But yet I was making 2, 3, 5, 10 new indicators a week, and thinking I had a better system, and I didn't have a better system. I just had more indicators. So whether you've got a method or a technique or a procedure, that's great. Compare it to what we have. We don't know of anybody that can find strength in a market movement, let alone find gaps before the gap occurs.